I am kneeling on the church foyer tiles with my palm pressed to a hymn book, because kneeling feels like a practical thing to do when the world is trying to make a choice for you. The sanctuary doors are closed behind me, and the echo of footfalls and organ practice vibrates somewhere inside the walls, as if history itself were breathing. My dress is folded over a pew like a promise I have not yet decided to keep, and the ribbon I once thought meant enduring has become a kind of instrument I could untie. The twist is in the small detail that will not let me forget: a pressed wildflower tucked into the pages where my fingers have rested, its petals the color of late summer sunsets. A quiet relic of the afternoons I have spent listening to sermons and pretending that the words were the only thing I needed. The church smells faintly of dust and lemon oil, and the very particular warmth of a place that holds a family's rituals. I feel both sheltered and exposed in the same breath. The two sensations braid into a single line of feeling that pulls at the corners of me like a thread demanding to be followed. She appears in my memory as a light that moved like a practical thing, efficient, warm, and unassuming until it refuses to be anything else. She is the pastor's daughter, an identity knitted to pulpit and pews, but not stitched into the small, secret pattern that grew between us. I first noticed her hands, capable, calloused in the right places from work around the church, the kind of hands that could hold a hymn book steady or mend a hem with equal grace. That day in the foyer, she reached across to pick up a stack of communion cups, and the way her fingers brushed mine sent a minor chord through me that insisted we needed a different song. There was nothing theatrical about it. She simply moved with the steady rhythm of someone comfortable in the architecture of the church, but curious about what happened between its walls. Her hair had been tucked back from her face, and the profile of her jaw looked like someone who had learned to listen hard and then to answer softer, which is how I found myself listening for reasons I had not known I needed. We shared small things at first: the odd task around the church that required two hands, the way we traded work shifts, the ephemeral intimacy of folding bulletins before a Sunday service. I learned the cadence of her days through those errands, the way she arrived early to light candles, how she rated the quality of tea, the precise way she arranged chairs so that each family member had a familiar sightline. We were both quietly practical people who liked lists and the comfort of tasks that had measurable ends. In between those tasks, we traded confessions in the form of unfinished sentences, the kind that sound like work orders until they unmask themselves as hopes. She would fold her hands around a mug and tell me about a book she had read in a single afternoon. I would tell her about the way streets looked at first snow. It was tidy, that beginning. It was the kind of friendship that could fit into sermon notes and church events, neat and unthreatening. But the body does not follow tidy rules. The small changes that threaded through our days were the kind that become languages when two people commit to learning them. A hand at the small of my back guiding me through a crowded fellowship hall, a shoulder that paused against mine when the heat in the room rose and my breath sounded too loud, fingers that lingered at the end of a handshake as if considering whether to turn a courtesy into something else. I cataloged them like a student of human weather, making careful notes: the minute her thumb tapped in thought, the way her laugh unfolded like a ribbon, how a particular freckle near her temple seemed to glow in late afternoon sunlight. It was slow, and slow turned into inevitability the way rivers make new beds. I remember the first time I noticed the shape of my own longing in public spaces, how I would lean and then calibrate as if physical closeness could be mapped like a set of polite rules. The map did not have symbols for the small devastations that love can leave. It only had a compass that kept turning toward her. Our first kiss was not a punctuation mark so much as an arithmetic solution. It happened in the sacristy after a funeral, when the world had been stripped of its usual noises and the quiet left room for hands to misbehave. She had wrapped a shawl around her shoulders, and the scent of it, her detergent or the faint trace of incense, folded into the air between us. I remember how her breath seemed to hitch as if someone had paused a song at a note that made everything else resolve differently. Our mouths met cautiously, and then, with a kind of learning, fingers exploring the base of a neck, the back of a shoulder, the small reassurance of a forearm pressed into someone's idiom of study. The kiss did not shout, it rearranged the furniture inside me. When we stepped back, the world had the quiet of something acknowledged. It was not dramatic. It was, instead, the precise sound of two people admitting that a new room had opened. The complication arrived with a list of expectations and the weight of generations. She is the pastor's daughter, and with that role comes a lattice of obligations, tabling for community fundraisers, greeting the faithful with practiced warmth, the private rituals of tending to grief that lands in pews every Sunday. The church is more than a setting for us. It is an organism with needs and histories. She had been reared to see her life as an answer to prayers, an offering to a congregation, to her father's script, to the cadence of duty. I had been raised differently, taught the virtue of individual choice and the geometry of personal boundaries. That difference, when pushed together by tenderness, became pressure. The first time I considered the possibility that our closeness might erupt into scandal, it was not abstract. An elder at the coffee hour commented on her helpful hands, and I watched her shoulder dip in a way that felt like apology for an affection she had not yet named. The church's expectations hovered like a temperature lethal to tender things if left unmitigated. Love in that context required calculation and courage. We kept our small rebellions precise. There were after-hours tasks that insulated us from the town's eyes, locking up hymnals while the choir lingered, sweeping floors until the moonlight became a partner in cleaning. There were notes passed on napkins in the church kitchen that were mostly about logistics, but carried side messages written in the margins. We developed codes. A napkin folded twice meant stay. A mug left on the left side of the counter was a sign that she would be late. Intimacy crept in on listicles and to-do items until the lists themselves blurred, becoming a vessel for the quiet work of being together. We learned to read each other's exhaustion and to answer without fanfare, a bowl of soup set on a table, a ride offered when a storm made travel complicated, the precise angle of a hand that invited privacy. The sweetness of it was the secret lingua franca that kept us alive while the world around us slept or judged or gossiped in voices too loud for confessionals. Then the first major twist arrived, no thunder, only the maddening clarity of being seen. A Sunday like any other had stretched itself into a longer day, a baptism in the morning, a wedding in the afternoon, an evening meeting about the food bank. People drifted through the church with their needs and their schedules, and I moved through them like a shadow that resented being trimmed. In a moment when the sanctuary emptied, she took my hand in the corridor, an ordinary gesture. Then, with a steadiness that felt like ordnance, she suggested we go to the garden for air. The garden, the one behind the vestry, was her secret place, a square of sun, a bench shaded by an old magnolia, the smell of green things. We sat in that safe space, and I felt the world simplify into the two of us. Then I noticed the car idling at the gate, lights on, an envelope on the dashboard. It belonged to her father, an invitation for him to speak at a regional event, a job offer, something that pulled him away and left questions in the family ledger. She looked at the envelope the way a person looks at a prophecy. In her hands it was both possibility and hunger. In mine it became the shape of consequences. That night I lay awake, listening to the town breathe. I thought about sermons I had learned by heart and how some lines had a subtext I had failed to hear, to love without condition. The question lodged in the space between my shoulder blades like a pebble in a shoe. What did loving her require of me? It required honesty, and it required courage. It required us to risk the scaffold of reputations. It required that she consider what it meant to hold a role that others had designed and whether she could accept a version of herself outside those walls. We had to decide if we would live with half-lives, the pastor's daughter on one hand and the woman she chose on the other, or throw away the charts and be tabulated by our own hands. The choice was an arithmetic of sacrifices, both small and devastating. Quick reminder, if you're enjoying this story, hit subscribe to Sapphic Tales so you don't miss the next one. Fear did not come as a single roaring animal. It arrived as the slow erosion of certainty. I worried about what the little things would become when amplified. A whispered kiss in the vestry becoming a rumor in the pews, a hand held by a window spotted and labeled. I feared hurting her father, who had baptized me and taught me that moral attitude could be a compass. I feared losing the safe harbor the church had been for me in childhood, that room where obligations were a kind of map. But fear is not a reason to bury a person's heart. It is a weather system demanding preparation. We prepared in the ways people who love cautiously do, planning exit strategies from commitments that would not survive a confession, rehearsing the sentences that might make mending easier, and more importantly, rehearsing the kinds of tenderness that could heal. We kept our private life layered with care, hotel rooms rented under false pretenses when we needed space, a plan to move out if the pressure became cruel, clear boundaries about what we would do when the town's eyes turned suspicious. The middle stretch of our story is full of the kind of practical romance that most novels like to disguise. We navigated church potlucks and children's choirs with the performative ease of actors while our insides rearranged themselves. There were moments of breathtaking tenderness that had nothing to do with scandal, like the time she mended a torn sleeve on my coat while humming an old hymn with a melody I did not care much for, but that suddenly felt like our music. She had a way of making utility sound like poetry, arranging the hymnals so that a child could find a favorite song, trimming the roses so that an elderly woman would have something fragrant to lift to her nose. In those everyday ministries, she taught me devotion in small increments. I learned to savor it. I learned the geography of her back when she bent over a chair, the weather in the freckle near her temple when she laughed, the way the light found her face at twilight like an answer to a question I had not yet articulated. Physical closeness grew like a careful garden. There were kisses in the church kitchen, quick and clandestine, the kind that tasted like dish soap and cinnamon rolls. A hand slipped under a scarf at a youth meeting to find a pulse and memorize its tempo, along. Wordless embrace in the vestry after an exhausting afternoon with grief counseling that left both of us raw. Each touch was both balm and marker. It soothed and it claimed. We learned the artistry of being tender in public and feral in private. Our kisses multiplied, some brief like punctuation, some sustained like paragraphs. The first sustained kiss, I recall, came after a particularly grueling evening when the congregation had demanded a show of faith, and she had offered a poetry reading that left us both depleted and enlivened. We went out into the cold, and without ceremony our mouths found one another, and the world narrowed to breath and a warmth that had nothing to do with the thermostat. The stakes grew when her father began to suspect. It was not accusation at first, but a protective worry that appears when a parent feels the world is rearranging a child's life. He noticed the way she smiled at me and the frequency of her lateness to choir practice. As the suspicion tightened like a wire, we found ourselves negotiating language that always felt too clumsy for what we meant. We began to talk about moving to a different town, about careers that could exist anywhere, about the practicalities of leaving a community with such entrenched expectations. There were nights loaded with lists and other nights with nothing but a pressing of palms until sleep arrived to rescue us. We practiced courage like a muscle. Sometimes it ached afterward. We reached our crisis when the church calendar collided with a family event that was impossible to ignore: her father's retirement ceremony, an evening scheduled and advertised, a public ritual of honor. The town expected a certain pageant, speeches, a reception, triptychs of gratitude. The event was not merely a public celebration, it was an embalming of identity in the eyes of a community. She stood at the back of the hall the night before and told me she was terrified of the way people would stare. Fear sheathed in ecclesiastical robes is a particular thing. It murmurs of betrayal not only to a family, but to faith itself. We knew what being together would mean when the microphones were on and the pews were full of people who relied on what she represented. We tried, for reasons I can now understand, to negotiate a private attendance, sit close, open hands, pretend to be companions rather than anything more. But secrets, like water, seek their own level. A program went missing and reappeared in a way that forced conversation. A photograph circulated that made its way into an email, and the net began to close. The night of the ceremony, our names began to shadow in footnotes and whispers. We sat in a quiet room away from the crowd, holding hands in a way that felt like a mutual vow. As her father ascended the stage to speak, I felt the gravity of all the years that had put us in that place. The moment required a choice. Announcement or silence, a life made public or a life kept private. If it kept you hooked, subscribe now to Sapphic Tales so you don't miss the next. The climax came like a weather pattern, heavy, undeniable, and full of possibility for both destruction and renewal. Her father, the man whose sermons had been part of our courtship with the church itself, paused in the middle of his retirement speech. He did not need a microphone to make the air feel thick, his weight carried in the hush. He said the kind of thing that reads like scripture in a small town, the gratitude, the lineage, the honor of being steward of souls, and then, abruptly, he said something else. He asked his daughter to stand. I felt my heartbeat, violent, translate into emotion that prepared me for whatever would happen. She rose as if the floor expected it. Her face was an open ledger, brave and honest. Instead of the scripted congratulations, she offered a voice that, though it did not speak with my words, offered an honesty that had been growing in secret. The hall leaned in as if to hear her breathe. The confession was not mine to rehearse, but when she looked at me then, the angle of her look was both apology and invitation. I rose too, because the body that loves is a thing that cannot simply be spectator. The fallout was immediate and complicated, a storm of prayers and questions, some tender, some accusatory, some simply bewildered. Her father, for all the sermons about grace, showed a devastation that belonged to parents who feel a child has stepped off a map they once read together. He retreated into a kind of silence that is louder than anger. The congregation split in its reactions, some steady, some unsure. We were both crushed and uplifted. For the first time our love had to live in the daylight, and daylight is honest in the ways darkness allows one to be coy. There were moments of incredible tenderness amid the rupture, friends who held our hands and said the smallest heroic things, small children who hugged and asked questions in blunt, unfiltered ways. Letters from people who offered food and support and others who left pews empty. The world did not dissolve into a single shape, it rearranged. Just a quick pause. If you're enjoying this, hit that subscribe button and stay with us here on Sapphic Tales. In the weeks after the confession, we learned fast what perseverance looked like. We spoke to counselors who knew faith and relationship both, and those conversations taught us practical ways to keep speaking when voices around us sought to silence. There were evenings when we sat on the back steps of the parish hall and shared cigarettes like contraband comfort, when we planned moves and rehearsed sentences that would be less wounding to family. We worked paperwork and legalities and the small scaffolding of life, leases, jobs shifted, the map redrawn. We also kept the inner life as main priority, bedside conversations about fear, whispered admissions of needing to be held, the honest exploration of what each of us wanted individually and together. Some nights we held each other until we remembered the cadence we first learned as friends. Other nights we wept without explanation, and that too was a part of the architecture of becoming. We kissed often in this season, a ritual that stitched parts of us back together. The kisses varied, quick pecks in public that were both defiance and reassurance, long, reclamation kisses in our apartment after a day of funeral-like silences, gentle kisses that healed frayed nerves after terse phone calls with family. Each kiss was a small ledger entry in our story, balancing losses with intimacy. The physical closeness changed from secret furtiveness to a steady presence. Hands became a vocabulary that said what words could not: hold me, stay, I am here, forgive what I could not anticipate. The work of mending with family was long and jagged. Her father eventually came to counseling with a reluctance that was both honest and brave. It did not mean immediate reconciliation, but it meant a willingness to listen. He saw us living as two people who were trying to do right by love and conscience, and his heart softened in small ways. My own family, who had loved the pastor's role and the security it promised, struggled as well, but time and our consistent presence eroded the sharpest edges. Acts of service and persistent care have a way of softening the hardest hearts. We brought meals, listened, visited, and at times simply sat without saying anything while the world did its complicated healing. The community that once recoiled sometimes learned to make room. Change can be a slow animal, but it moves. Months after the confession, the crisis reached a softer resolution. Her father, through a long series of small reckonings and conversations, found a kind of acceptance that never fully resembled the life he had planned for his daughter, but that acknowledged the truth of her joy. He did not become our loudest champion, but he learned to see us in the morning light and not look away. The congregation, too, reshaped itself in ways that surprised me. Some left, some arrived, some stayed and did the heart work of inclusion. Our relationship settled into a life stitched from both compromise and absolute delight. We moved into a small apartment not far from the church and learned to make domestic rituals, shopping, laundry, the Sunday chore of setting out cups feel like acts of worship in themselves. If it kept you hooked, subscribe now to Sapphic Tales so you don't miss the next. Our nights became a repository of resilient tenderness. The first night we fell asleep together in a bed that belonged to both of us, I felt an ease I had never let in before. We arranged pillows like peace offerings and spoken whispers about fears that had nothing to do with scandal, aging, the possibility of children or not, the small quarrels that tend to creep into joint lives. We learned to apologize in ways that meant something, an earnest back massage, a note left on a pillow, the discipline of asking how to be enough without drowning out the other person's wants. Bedside conversations taught us the art of timing, when to speak, when to hold, when to leave space. The years that followed were not a downhill smoothing out into placidity. There were relapses into old patterns of worry and flare-ups of judgment from those who had not yet learned to offer kindness in new forms. But there were also triumphs. A small garden of herbs on our balcony that she tended, a tiny dog that followed our footsteps and believed in us without condition. The morning I watched her rehearse a talk she would give. Her confidence had grown and her voice had found a new timbre that belonged to neither pulpit nor apology, but to a woman who had learned to be holy herself. I often retrace the earliest image of her hands picking up communion cups, because images are how we anchor ourselves in memory. That simple practical motion presaged a life that would involve practical courage, the daily decisions to stay and be kind, and the strategic leaps that reconfigure a life. Our love is not the end of a sermon, but a continuation of one generous truth I have learned and relearned. The heart can be trusted with complexity. Choosing each other was rarely easy, but it was almost always right. Quick reminder, if you're enjoying this story, hit subscribe to Sapphic Tales so you don't miss the next one. Now, when I stand in the church foyer, I notice that pressed wildflower again, somehow still in the pages those seasons have passed. I touch it and feel the same small swell of courage that made me kneel on tile and hold my life up to inspection. She passes by, her hand warm when it brushes mine, and I understand that the sermon I needed was embodied in our ordinary acts, staying, making tea, folding bulletins, listening. In the hush between services, when the light comes through the stained glass and paints the floor in colors that look like promises, I know how to measure my life differently. We learned to love in ways that were tender and administrative, fierce and kind, public and private. We built a life not despite the church, but alongside it, acknowledging its needs without letting them own our hearts. That balancing is our practice. Just a quick pause. If you're enjoying this, hit that subscribe button and stay with us here on Sapphic Tales. If there is a final image I keep returning to, it is not of confrontation or collapse, but of a small, repeated gesture, her hand finding mine in a quiet place, a grocery aisle, a hospital waiting room, the bench behind the vestry, simple, steady, and unapologetic. The gesture is our answer to everyone who once asked us to choose between duty and love. We did not abandon duty, we broadened it to hold more. We did not make a spectacle of ourselves. We decided to be a quiet revolution in ordinary clothes. That, more than any sermon or argument, is how we changed the map. We learned to live in the open and to be brave where it matters most, in the small acts of care performed over and over.